Hello and welcome to the Mobalytics patch 11.9 High-ELO tier list. I'm Dan Orcs Harrison, and there's quite a big spread of champion and item changes in the patch, and as per usual our team of experts have reviewed these changes and we'll be going over how the patch is developed and what's been excelling in solo queue. Let's get stuck in. Starting off with the top lane, in God tier we have Riven, Lee Sin and Darius, and the S tier we have Wukong, Set, Shen, Urgot, Vladimir, Aatrox, Aurelia and Camille. The top lane we saw quite a bit of movement. Wukong is performing really solidly as a pick who can answer Gnar in the laning phase, but it's also a huge threat into AD carries and backlines in general, and so has risen up to S tier. We also saw Shen move up as a result of the buff, which caused his ult shield to scale with bonus HP. He holds pretty solidly into melee matchups in the top lane due to his trading power, and this change allows him to offer more later in the game. Rumble has started to show up more since he's had his passive buff to allow him trade better with an attack speed boost and percentage HP damage, and Quinn has been a solid high-elo pick that can deal with bruises and become a pain point later in the game due to his side laning. Gnar has dropped down, he's received a few nerfs over the previous patches and has started to feel them. He's still decent in the right matchups, but he isn't as reliable of a blind pick anymore. Something that has emerged as a very relevant solo laner is Lee Sin. He's received some buffs to try and push him more into the jungle, but after some experimentation in solo lanes and a buff to his ECD, he's been really flourishing. His high mobility, sustain and strong dueling potential make him a brutal laner to go up against. Later in the game he functions as a bulky bruiser, but with his high AD scalings, his build allows him to burst squishier targets and cut through tankier opponents. Lee Sin actually holds pretty well into range matchups due to how many gap closes he has, which is why he's also functioning well in mid lane. Into melee bruisers, a big aspect of him going toe for toe is his W when self-cast is on a 6-second cooldown before any ability haste, and this allows him to consistently shield himself, have passive stacks and also give himself Omnivamp. Set got some big buffs to his AD builds, and the final ones from this patch have put him in a really solid position. His ult now has a 120% bonus AD ratio, and the ratio on his W has been doubled. Essentially what has been happening is he's capable of bursting almost any target as the true damage from his W is huge, and to top that off with an AD build he decimates targets. Squishier targets will die to his combo, but even tankier targets will struggle against his percentage HP damage on his Q, which scales with AD and the fact he can itemize specifically to target tankier opponents with items like Blade of the Rune King. Set has always been a powerful laner, and now that his scaling holds up a lot better in the mid to late game, he's a force to be reckoned with. So Vlad has his Q cooldown reduced, and then on this patch he just had over half that change reverted. The thing is, any cooldown reduction on his Q is massive because of how heavily reliant he is on it. Even with the partial reversion, he's still in a dominant position due to how well he's been syncing up with items like Rocket Belt and Cosmic Drive. I think this was a combination of these buffs being really significant to Vlad's playstyle, and also that people were sleeping on him a bit, as with his current build, you can rapidly acquire ability haste to a crazy degree. Getting his Q down to around a 2-second cooldown means you can very quickly stack your empowered Q, which does huge damage and heals for a ton. In terms of the high-elo meta, he's the best performing AP top laner and scales incredibly well into the later stages. Definitely a good pickup if your team needs AP or you want to 1v9 teamfights later in the game. Moving on to the jungle. We don't have any champions of the God tier, and in the S tier we have Morgana, Fiddlesticks, Udyr and Shaco. In the jungle, the most significant change was a nerf to Hecarim. He heavily dictated the meta, being arguably the strongest and most prominent jungler. He definitely had rougher matchups and Udyr could outpace and as a result outperforming, but he was so consistent a threat, and being able to go tank and still solo out squishier carries made him a huge threat. The changes made his tank build essentially dead and the win rate plummeted. Now he's still seeing some more success when build more AD focus with the Triforce, but he's still very much a B tier champion, has left a vacuum in his wake. In other changes, Zac was feeling the benefit of some buffs to his W damage, which helped speed up his clear. Xin Zhao, after his mini rework, is in a decent spot and is very capable of finding a lot of early momentum with strong ganks and skirmishing. Diana has actually started to struggle a decent amount after her latest nerfs to tone her down. Her clear became slower and less healthy, and that was a big factor in her being enabled in the jungle. She's still solid, just not as overpowering as she was on 11.8. Another pick who's been excelling in solo queue is Shaco, simply because of how prominent he is in finding successful early ganks. He's really threatening, his clear is decent ever since he got AU in his boxes, and although he is a bit more of a one-trick champion, it's easy to find a high win rate on him if you got a couple of games under your belt. Honing in on our highlight picks, first up is Udyr. He's been a consistent and dominant force at high-elo, even with constant nerfs to Turbo Chem Tank, he's still in a really solid spot. His clear speed is really high, he's capable of invading whenever he pleases as his dueling is great, and he has a movement speed to get out of tricky situations, and honestly, although he does fall off in the late game, his mid game is really solid as he becomes often too tanky for most champions to cut through effectively. Udyr seems like an easy champion in concept, but your pathing being effective is vital at higher ranks, and you need to push your early game advantage and look to deny the enemy jungler. I've seen pro play scenarios where an Udyr has gotten a 3-level lead over a Hecarim due to this, and it's the ability to do this that makes him flourish in high elo. Fiddle has a crazy win rate in higher ranks, and a big factor is he's just a solo queue monster. Even at these higher ranks, he isn't respected, and his ability to constantly threaten over walls and dominate teamfights with his ultimate make him good at stomping when ahead. Vision control is vital when playing Fiddlesticks, and you'll always want a control ward on hand to be able to create pockets of vision and make it difficult for the enemy team to move through the jungle. The constant threat of your ultimate makes it hard to push up and gain ground, and so when ahead he can completely control areas of the map and section the enemy team away. Fiddlesticks has a very healthy clear, and the speed is decent, especially as there is places where you can clear multiple camps at once to speed things up. Morgana got some huge buffs to her clear speed on 11.8, and although they toned back slightly, she looks like she's here to stay for the time being. Morgana's clear speed allows her to power farm effectively and keep pace with champs like Udyr. On top of that, her pick potential allows for strong setup for your team, as often connecting a binding just guarantees death for your opponents if they're out of position. Damage is also considerable. In clumped up fights, her pool can shred, which is particularly effective in choke points, and a binding into pool can chunk or squish your target heavily. On top of Morgana's strength in damage and pick, her utility with the Black Shield can keep her allies safe and mitigate threat to your important carries. Moving on to the mid lane, in the God tier we have Qiyana and Rumble, and in the S tier we have Tristana, Annie, Ahri, Viego, Castan, Galio, Vladimir, Twisted Fate, Talon, Yone, Victor, Zed, Sylas and Katarina, so a lot. Mid lane hasn't seen too much of a shift up. Vlad is matching his mid lane performance and has moved up to S tier, and we saw similar success with Lee Sin, although he's only moved to A in comparison to his S tier rating in top. Sylas has been looking really solid. He has a strong laning phase and his skirmishing is excellent. He can be somewhat situational, as into champions with great ultimates like Alistar is incredibly powerful, whereas picks like Udyr don't really offering too much with choice when it comes to using his ult. Xerath got some solid buffs that'll help his scaling, but still has a lot of rough matchups which can cause issues for him, and so is only a B tier pick. Onto our highlights, first up is our God tier pick Qiyana. Qiyana excels at snowballing due to her high base AD ratios given a huge burst, and she's also great at roaming as she has strong wave clear to give herself priority, so she has the freedom to move. Her skirmishing is really powerful as she has the ability to apply CC, go invisible, or grant herself extra execute damage in the back of her Q. Prowler's Claw has emerged as a really strong mythic for her, as the mythic passive granting extra lethality allows you to get a ton of damage, and the active can help you 100-0 a target or come out ahead in a duel. Serpent's Fang is a popular second item, and although this functions really effectively into shields, and that can be against champions like Karma or Seraphine, or even just bruisers who have built things like Sterak's, it's also got really solid stats for the price, so it can often be a viable option even when there isn't any shielding on the enemy team. Stacking as much lethality for as little cost is exactly what Qiyana looks to do. Qiyana also serves well in teamfights. A lot of assassins can struggle here and tend to prefer isolated targets, but Qiyana's ultimate can easily decimate an entire team if they're positioned too close to a wall. Rumble is really performing well at High-ELO. One big aspect is his flexibility. He's a potential pick in the top lane or jungle, and so it leaves an element of unpredictability when the enemy team wants to know lane matchups. In terms of what he offers, he actually has really high burst damage and is capable of bursting squishier targets really quickly. To amplify this, he's been building Night Harvester, and this allows you to 100-0 target without any MR, with just a couple of harpoons and some flame spitter takes. It goes without saying that a huge strength of Rumble is his ultimate. Landing a big equalizer is a fight winner almost by default, and particularly against some of the stronger meta AD carries who don't have dashes, they'll be toasted and struggle to move off without having a flash available. Mid game is where you excel and should look to be ready with your ultimate to fight neutral objectives like dragons or heralds. When it comes to barons, the enemy team will really struggle to start them with you alive, as your ultimate can easily trap a team in the baron pit, and with Nashor's magic resist shred, it's an easy recipe for a teamfight win. Zed has been really solid at higher ranks. He's very much a champion who's as good as the player who wields him. A high skill cap but tons of potential, you're easily capable of solo killing your opponent, and this goes up hugely when you hit level 6. Similar to Qiyana, your roaming and burst potential are what makes Zed shine. Looking for windows to move bot lane, top, or even assisting your jungler with invades allows you to find skirmishes, which is where Zed excels. His mobility and passive allows you to finish off low HP targets easily, and often joining a skirmish late can easily result in a win for you if targets are low on cooldowns and close to death. A big factor with playing Zed is being aware of when opponents have bought stopwatches, so keep spamming tab and checking. Worst case scenario is you're ulting a target who turns golden, and then you don't get the kill and you're often in a really vulnerable position. Looking at AD carries, in the God tier we have Jinx, and in the S tier we have Tristana, Jhin, Varus, Vayne and Kai'Sa. AD carries haven't seen too much of a shift up overall. The meta is pretty established at higher ranks. We did see a bump up for Jhin, whose win rate has been pretty solid. He did go through a rough patch where he wasn't having as much representation, but he does seem to have recovered. Seraphine has dropped down due to the range of nerfs both the Moonstone and her kit. AD carry is still probably his strongest role, as mid and support took the changes hardest, but she's still substantially weaker than she was earlier in the season. Jinx is the premier AD carry right now. Her laning is strong, her traps allow solid self peel, her ultimate can steal nutrients like Baron from a huge amount of HP, and the biggest thing is her range and scaling. In most late game scenarios, her range simply outclasses most champions in the game. Being able to output so much consistent damage while most champions can't fire back forces the enemy team to dive you to deal with you, and as long as your team is in a position to peel you, then you should be golden. Jinx in the right hands is monstrous and the go-to for carrying games at any rank. Varus has emerged as a strong pick after a series of buffs this season. A big aspect is his flexibility. There's 2 builds available, one that plays around his arrow damage in a more poke build, but with Halo Blades it still has decent auto damage. And the other one is a lethal tempo build with more typical crit items, allowing for more DPS for shredding tankier targets. Both are viable and can be played depending on what your team needs. Varus' laning phase is strong as he can trade effectively with his abilities and has decent range to match up with most targets. On top of that, after 6 his 2v2 is really powerful and he's able to make picks on the back of his ult. Civ is a really consistent pick. She has the ability to shred waves quickly with a ricochet and boomerang blade, and her scaling is solid, so even if a game starts badly, you can look to slow the pace of the game down until you're strong enough to carry. With her most popular build, she does huge damage with the Q, she's ideal with CC support as it guarantees you can connect, and the burst available is really threatening to squish your targets. On top of that, Sivir has a lot of utility, her ult providing movement speed for allies allows you to help start fights and pick off isolated targets. Now on to support. In the God tier we have Bard and Lulu, and in the S tier we have Senna and Thresh. Support has remained pretty stagnant within tiers, but item changes have made small impacts. Soraka and Sona did get a bump up thanks to these changes, with Moonstone being buffed and Shrelia's being a strong alternative. A spicy pick that has emerged is Talia's support. The play rate is low, but our expert has seen some games and the win rate is solid. Essentially, you are able to roam around effectively and join skirmishes across the map. You look to build Everfrost and your combo is super threatening. Even as a support, you can burst squishy targets with some help. Ideally, you want to play when teammates have CC to set you up so you can seismic shove and guarantee you'll hit. Lulu, for some reason, was buffed on 11-9. She's really strong after Shrelia's changes, as she's capable of making her AD carries super strong and buffing them with movement speed as well. With hyperscaling champs like Jinx running around, she's really powerful. The most recent buff reduced the cooldown on a W, which is a really strong ability. Not only can it raise the movement speed and attack speed of your allies, which syncs up with Shrelia's, but it's incredibly effective at shutting down opposing threats. At max rank, it polymorphs a target for 2.25 seconds, stopping them from attacking or casting spells and slowing them. Against highly mobile assassins, fighters or bruisers, this is a godsend and can easily shut them down, allowing your team to deal with them effectively. Thresh is a jack of all trades. He doesn't have awful matchups as he's able to mitigate aggressive picks by interrupting their engages and threatening enchanters with his hook. Meta AD carries tend to be immobile and he's able to keep them safe with his lantern while also being able to threaten them on the opposing team. Thresh's lantern is honestly a really powerful aspect of his kit. The shield in combination with Guardian can absorb a large amount of damage, and the range at which you can pull an ally can keep them safe from engages as long as you're positioned well. Oftentimes there'll be situations in lane where you'll look to play lantern, which is where you stand back from the AD carries ready to get them out of danger. This is useful when your wave is close to their tower and you're cautious about the enemy jungler ganking. You need to be aware that some champions can interrupt your lantern, and also it can be blocked by a well-placed control ward. Senna is in a really solid spot. Best utilised in the fasting lane, but still functioning okay outside of it in the right matchups. The big reason she's strong is her tank build. Grass syncs super well with her as she's able to easily proc it in lane with the Q, and once you start sacking souls, you still do solid damage from a long range, but being tank, you aren't as easy to punish. Senna's laning is oppressive, and looking to trade as much as possible is typically the win condition, but infinite scaling means there is a fallback if you do end up behind. Range is a really broken aspect in League of Legends, and with Senna easily able to hit 800 auto attack range by the late game, it's super difficult for most champions to deal with, especially she'll be slow on targets, and even if you do get on top of her, she'll be super bulky with this build. Your DPS isn't as high as a Kraken Slayer build, so having a sustained DPS carry in your team is typically important, and your utility will allow them to succeed. That wraps things up for our 11-9 High-ELO tier list. I hope this has been helpful and you feel a bit more clued up on the High-ELO meta. Be sure to subscribe if you want to keep updated with our tier list, and fly on over to Mobalytics.gg to check out the full list in one place.